Hello, everyone. It's Marc Sabatella here from the Mastering MuseScore School, and welcome to the MuseScore Café for today, Wednesday, December 9th, 2020. And it's so good to see everyone here and checking in the chat. That's all great. Hello, everyone. Good. Audio's working. That's always good. This is my weekly series of these video streams that I do for anyone who's new, and I just pick some topic or someone suggests a topic to me, and I talk about it, demo some things, and you can ask questions via the chat and so forth. So what I want to talk about today is lead sheets for a number of reasons, and I'm always, willing to entertain questions on other topics. And if I can manage to squeeze it into a discussion of lead sheets, I will do so. And one of the reasons I'm talking about lead sheets, well, there's always like multiple reasons I pick a topic, but one reason is I've been kind of doing this thing these last, starting maybe a week or two ago, where I'm looking at some Christmas songs and trying to come up with some harmonizations of them. So, for instance, here you can see a version that I created once upon a time of Silent Night. And you can ignore the fact that it says it's a newer version. I created it with a trial version, a beta version of 3.6, which I definitely will be talking about next week. So this is one example of a very, very, very simple lead sheet. And so when you're trying to just come up with a harmonization of a melody, often a lead sheet format is great for this, because then you just deal with the melody and you can put some chord symbols there and deal with it that way. But it's also just a very practical thing to perform from if you are playing in a style like jazz or pop, really any sort of popular music. This is what we're normally playing from, are just lead sheets or other sorts of simplified things that are not full scores. So that's one reason why I want to talk about lead sheets, is just to tie into some of the stuff I'm also talking about with Christmas songs in my music masterclass, which, by the way, is a thing. Remember, Thursdays I now do another live stream. But the other thing that just happened recently is there is a very famous jazz club in Denver called El Chapultepec, that I was the house pianist there for many years, and they just announced a couple days they're closing. And so there's all sorts of reminiscence and so forth about El Chapultepec, which is, it's been there for decades. It actually opened the day after Prohibition. They've only been doing jazz since the 70s. But yeah, it's kind of a big deal that this club is closing. And during the time that I was in the house band there, I actually led the band for like 2 years, and the saxophonist in the group, Keith Oxman, and we just decided, usually at El Chapultepec, people play standards. They play, tunes that all jazz musicians know, because it's a very kind of loose jam session-y vibe there. But we sort of decided we really wanted to do a lot of original material. And so we wrote a new piece almost every week, and then sight read it right there on the bandstand. And one of the things that I want to talk about is what things happen in lead sheets, how you create them in ways that are designed to facilitate sight reading on the bandstand, especially in dark, smoky jazz clubs, because indeed it was smoky. It was affected by COVID, but it wasn't just that. There was a whole lot of other things. This was a 100-year-old building that then, in what was just a abandoned part of downtown, and then the entire downtown gentrified around it, and it's now surrounded by sports bars and dance clubs and the baseball stadium and all this other stuff. And then in the middle of it is this 100-year-old jazz club dive bar that just writing had been on the wall for a while. Anyhow, that's some of the things that I want to talk about here, and I'm just catching up on the chat here, and I'm seeing some names of some people I haven't seen here in the chat before, so this is great. And definitely feel free to be asking questions. Oh no, so Colleen, you're having a problem. Start a new page. It sounds like maybe it's crashing, but I'll have to talk to you about that later. So yeah, let me get started here by talking about some things relating to this, and I'll tell a couple El Chapultepec stories along the way. I guess I just told you one where we wrote new tunes every week. This is one of them, and we actually recorded it. Um, so this here is a lead sheet that I wrote during that time. I wasn't using MuseScore yet. This is when I was still using Finale, and one of the things that I did was update. When I first started using MuseScore, I wanted to take all my old pieces. And I didn't take every composition I ever wrote, but I decided I wanted to take all of my lead sheets because I had like 50 to 100 original compositions in lead sheet format, and I got them all into MuseScore. And so this is an example of a rather more complex lead sheet than the one that than the Silent Night one here. But I want to talk a little bit about some generalities here, and I'm going to do this by creating two lead sheets. And we're going to do this, we're going to do just show you some of the things that happen with lead sheets. And I wrote a whole bunch of notes to myself. One of the things that's very traditional in jazz lead sheets. So this here, for people who are jazz musicians, this is the book that most people learned a whole lot of tunes from, a fake book, it's called, because if you play from a lead sheet, you're just faking it. You're not really reading sheet music, which is insulting because it's actually a very complex operation to be able to create your own part from a lead sheet like this. And it's a time-honored tradition that's been going on for centuries. I mean, it's figured bass in the Baroque era is the same thing. So in any case, some of the things, I mean, I'll hold it up to the camera. I don't know how well it actually reads. There's a number of unique qualities about the way this lead sheet works, and this is pretty typical. One of them is it's handwritten. This was actually produced with a combination of handwriting for the text and a handwritten looking font for the notation. Well, so in MuseScore we have a handwritten looking font for both text and notation. And so if when you create a score, I'll just call it my lead sheet, and if you create your score, and in the template selection under jazz, you can select jazz lead sheet. Now, if you don't want that look, if you don't want that handwritten look, well, then maybe don't pick that template. Just use the default empty score, or just use the treble clef template. So I will go ahead and create this lead sheet here. And so now it's set up with the handwritten font and all. There's a number of other things that happen that we chose not to do. Like, let me add a key signature to this piece, and I want to talk about that. So this is set up in a traditional way where the first system shows the clef, key signature, and time signature. Subsequent systems just show the clef and key signature, no time signature. This is a tradition that's been around for centuries. I guess because maybe key signatures change more often than time signatures historically, and so do clefs, and so they felt the need to repeat them on every system, but not time signatures. In a lot of jazz lead sheets, that doesn't happen. They don't repeat anything. This, to me, is not necessarily something you want to emulate. But I can tell you a little bit about why this exists. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to say format. One of the things we definitely like to do is make a consistent number of measures per line, although we're not necessarily always completely consistent, and I'll talk about that too. So when you do this, you get measures that are roughly the same width, except the first measure is wider because of the clef and the key signature. I mean, the part within the measure is the same width as the other measures, but the whole measure is wider. Now, of course, as you start filling this up with notes, they won't stay the same width, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But because things were handwritten, there was this tradition of saying, well, I'm going to make life easier for myself. I'm just going to draw bar lines exactly on the midpoint of that staff, and then exactly the midpoint, right? So this bar line here, if you can see, is exactly the midpoint of that staff. And then you draw another bar line exactly on the midpoint there. And now you have 4 exactly equal width measures, and then you can start writing in your notes. That kind of saves you from getting into the situation where you've already put in 3 measures and then you realize you either don't have enough room for the 4th measure and you have to write tiny, or you left yourself too much room and you have to space things out huge. So as a practical consideration, the idea of making measures the same width came about. But there's also another reason why that's actually not a terrible idea. Let me put in some notes here. So in this version here, let me just put a whole note there and just leave that there. So in this measure, now the measure with all the 16ths is necessarily wider than the other measures, and that's the norm in music notation. And we like that because that way it means that if you then have some 16ths in this measure, they end up being the same spacing as the ones in this measure, where if the measures were the same width, these 16ths would end up being wider because there's fewer of them. That's just how it would work out. But as soon as you go and put chord symbols into this, then that spacing isn't as advantageous. If I let me use Control K to put in chord symbols, and let me remember to put in my, there we go. Get screen key happening so you can see my shortcuts. Well, control detected. Okay, so for whatever reason, it's not working. There we go. Okay, cool. If I type Control K and type a chord symbol there, and let's say I put that in there, and then I'm going to use semicolon, moves a beat at a time. That's a nice thing to know. If you hit spacebar, it moves 1 note at a time, and with all the 16ths, I don't want that. So a semicolon moves a beat at a time, regardless of whether there's notes there or not. So, and in this measure, I'll do the same thing. D. So someone reading this chart, if you are reading the notes, the spacing is great. But if you're only reading the chord symbols, and think about this, the rhythm section in a typical setting in which you're using lead sheets, maybe there's a melody, a saxophone or a trumpet player playing the melody, or a singer singing the melody, and everyone else in the band, the guitar, piano, bass, drums, we're not paying attention. I shouldn't say we're not paying attention to the melody, but that's not what we're reading. We're mostly dealing with the chord symbols, right? And so if you look at this, the spacing of the chord symbols is now terribly uneven. You have this looks like dad, and then and then duh, and then Ada. So the spacing here is not at all. Oh, actually, this one's in the wrong place. So let me, because I was trying to do these every 2 beats. Let's get this where it belongs over here. It's da and then da. So yeah, this spacing doesn't make it really clear that these chords are 2 beats apiece. And so it ends up being something you might want to do. Oh, wow, thank you. So yeah, you can actually, this is a thing now, right? Now that I hit 1,000 or 2,000 subscribers, I hit this lovely thing where people can do super tip things. I don't even know what they're called, but thank you. The spacing is a little bit not ideal here. Now, trying to make the measure literally the same width isn't necessarily the best way to go either, but what you can try to do is use the stretch commands. So it's shift, and so again, my, I just can't trust my, the thing that I have going that's supposed to show you the keyboard shortcuts, but I'm hitting the the right curly brace is the shortcut for format, stretch, increase, layout, stretch, right? The right curly brace there. So I can start increasing the stretch of this measure and maybe some of the other measures and try to kind of eyeball it until they seem like they're equal enough, right? So there used to be a command to force the measures to be equal the same width years and years and years ago, and it was removed because it was dumb. Basically, it would gladly make a measure too short to fit the notes, and so that wasn't going to work, and we didn't have any easy way around it, so we just disabled the thing. I'm hoping we can add that back someday. Let me keep checking on keep checking on the comments here. Oh yeah, by the way, so I saw Colleen. Thanks for mentioning the painting. I do have a painting of it. I'll drag that up later. Because I do paint. So anyhow, this idea that I'm doing here of fiddling with the contents, the stretch of the measures to try to equalize things. Well, the good thing about lead sheets is they're typically short, right? One of the whole points of doing this is to make it fit on just a page or a page or two, so you're not reading a 20-page piece of music on the bandstand. You're just reading a page or two. And so it's not out of the question that you could do things with this stretch. But there is another possibility that often works. And let me show you that. So I'm going to go remove. I'm going to reset all that stretch. Oh, so I mentioned about the clef and the key signature. I prefer to keep the clef and the key signature because music does change clefs and key signatures, especially key signatures, in a lot of the music that I do, and time signatures for that matter. So I'm not a fan of omitting the clef. Oh, and another reason to not omit the clef is you might go back and forth between one staff and two staves. So let me finish talking about spacing, and then I'll come back to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Format, Style, Measure. And in here, the very first setting here is minimum measure width. And that's what determines the width of measures in scores where, like, if I created a new score, well, the way you saw it before I entered any notes, right, or before I added those line breaks every 4 bars, measures are really wide, are really skinny. That's 5 spaces wide. That's what that default is. But if I go back to Format, Style, Measure, and I increase that minimum measure width, I can often get to a point where it equalizes the measure widths for me. See? Now, if I go too far, it's going to be, oh, now I can't actually fit all that on one line. So a value of 20, if you have, I'm in, what is my page size here? It's A4. That's because on Linux, there's this weird issue where it doesn't always figure out the page size. I'm in the United States. I should be getting letter size default paper. And it determines that really by looking at your default printer and so forth, but it doesn't always work right on Linux, and that's what I'm running on my Chromebook here. But in any case, that setting there that I did of 20 spaces gives me pretty good spacing. I guess it's not really that good, is it? Yeah, it's not that great. It's still the case that these measures are too narrow. So I can just, fiddle with those. But in any case, it gets you a better starting point. So if you're looking to equalize measure widths a little bit, you can do that. Someday, hopefully, we'll be able to do that. But the other thing you can do, though, in conjunction with that, is reduce the the note spacing. Right now, it's forcing there to be at least, there we go. So by 0.25 spaces between notes. If I reduce that, then my sixteenths can get closer together. Now you have to question whether it's worth doing this. Do you really want your sixteenths that close together? And now see what I mean about the spacing of the sixteenths? If you try to do this equal measure width business, you are going to reach these situations where your sixteenths are really packed in one measure, but are widely spaced in another, and that's not good. And that's kind of why this practice is generally frowned upon. So the way I got the 4 measures per staff is I went to Format, Add, Remove System Breaks, and then it defaults to every 4 measures. So this is definitely a thing. However, you can do it. Let me undo that. You can also do it just for a section. Like you could do it for just this number of measures and say, select your measures, then go in and say add remove system breaks every 4 measures. What that does is it allows you to have situations where one system might have fewer or more measures. And this is really important because, well, pickups, for instance. In this particular score here, this was notey enough that it was going to be too squished to try to get 4 measures per line. There's too many eighth notes and 16th notes, too many chord symbols kind of crammed together. And I realized that trying to make this 4 measures per line wasn't going to work for me. So I did 3 measures per line mostly. And so I selected here and did 3 measures per line. But then there were places where 4 measures really made a lot more sense. So I did 4 measures there. And so here it's not just a single setting to force 4 measures. It's a matter of selecting the measures you want. The other thing that happens really often in a lot of music is first and second endings, right? I mean, you might have music in which you have a first ending here that's a measure long. And then what are you going to do? Start the next line with your second ending, and then 4 measures later have a break. And then that means after your second ending, let's go ahead and put in a... let's go to my favorite palette here that I created for myself. This is my layout palette that has all the things that I do with layout, and I'll be showing off a bunch more of these things. So I've got my repeat here at the end of my first 8 measure phrase, then I have my second measure, and now suddenly the bridge of the song is starting in the middle of a line. Well, this is one of the things you might want to try to avoid. If the point is readability and really making sure that people can sight read this thing on a bandstand, it really helps if the major sections of the piece actually start at the beginning of lines. Oh, the bridge is right here at the beginning of the line. It really makes parsing the music in your brain while you're improvising and sight reading a lot easier. So in this case, I would prefer not to have that line break, but instead to have a line break there after the second ending. So I'm going ahead and manually adding these line breaks so that this system can have 5 measures instead of 4 like the rest. This is the kind of thing you really want to do if you're trying to really honor readability. And this is where the old style just blindly put in 4 measures per line because it's easy when you're doing it by hand. People get used to that and they think, oh, that's how lead sheets are done. Well, no, that's how handwritten lead sheets are done. Lead sheets that are done with real care to thinking about these issues, you do things like what I'm showing here of saying, no, I'm going to put 5 measures on this line so that my bridge can start at the beginning of a system. This actually helps with things. So now about the clef. So I mentioned that in this, in my example here, I was struggling to get the measures the same, the same width because I was trying to get a higher minimum measure width, and it's this clef and key signature that are killing me. So I can make them go away. Let me right-click the staff part properties, and say, you know what, I don't want to see a clef. And I will show time signatures. Oh, no, it's not that I don't want to show the clef. Sorry, that is not the right place to go. Go instead to Format, Style, Page. And here is where you say, I don't want a clef for all systems, and it'll only give you at the beginning. I don't want a key signature for all systems. It'll only give it to you at the beginning. So that saved a lot of room right there. And now suddenly, let me reset my stretch again and see how close I can get just with my measure, my style settings. So here now, maybe I can get a higher minimum measure width. Yeah, I can get up to 23 as a minimum measure width. I actually don't know if that will be if I'll be able to get that once I put notes in everywhere else, but it's possible. So I can do that. I'll just call it 22. But you can see now my measure widths are almost perfect, and that's with no stretch at all. So I increased the minimum measure width, decreased the note spacing, and it allowed that. And now I can just see if I can finagle it a little bit more. And yeah, see, it's still gonna think, oh, to do that, it's gonna just have to make these notes practically touch, and that's just not gonna work. But this is close now, right? The spacing here is much more like even spacing if you follow these bar lines. Realistically, making the bar lines be perfectly aligned is bad for readability because it makes it harder to tell you are where you are. If you're looking at the music and then you look down at your instrument or look out at the audience and then you go back and look at the page. Okay, I'm going to tell a story because it's a great story. It's my favorite El Chapultepec story. But you go back and look at the page after looking off into space, and now it's harder to tell where you are because every system looks the same because the bar lines all line up. So one of my favorite looking off into space stories. I'll try to make this brief, but it's a great story. You'll love it. I was playing there one night, and it was a quartet. And I'm playing the piano, and the saxophonist plays the melody, and then he takes his solo, improvised solo. You know, if you know how jazz works, you kind of take turns taking improvised solos, and I'm accompanying him. And then he stops playing, his solo, and it's time for me to take my improvised solo, and I'm soloing, and I'm like closing my eyes and doing all the looking off into space. I'm in another world when I'm soloing, and so I do this, and I'm soloing, looking off into space, eyes closed, whatever. And then when I'm done, I come back to reality, open my eyes, and look to tell the saxophonist, okay, time for you to come back in now and play the melody. Except I can't find him. He's not there. He's not on the stage. And this is a tiny, tiny little stage. You have to realize. I mean, this calling it a stage is it's not a stage. It's just a raised area within a tiny, tiny club. And the place is packed. I mean, it's wall to wall people standing as this place is just packed with people. And I'm like, what the heck happened to the saxophonist? Did he go in the back room? Is he looking for a new reed? What's going on? So I just had to finish out the tune myself and played the melody out myself. And then he's still nowhere to be found. And I was like, what's going on? And so I just had to play the rest of the next tune. I just had to play the melody myself, and we just played the whole rest of that set without a saxophonist. And I had no idea what was happening. And so when the set finished, I go out into the audience and start asking people, "Hey, did anyone see what happened to our saxophonist?" And they all look at me like I'm crazy and say, "Didn't you see? He got arrested." So the cops came in and pulled him off the bandstand while I was soloing. This was not Keith Oxman, but that is how Keith Oxman got the gig. Was the previous guy on the gig managed to get himself arrested in the middle of the gig, and I missed it entirely because I am completely zoned out while I'm soloing. So anyhow, that's my story. One of my El Chapultepec stories. So yeah, these are some things that you might do. So making the clef and key signature go away, you can do if you want to reproduce that whole look. Oh, I guess the actual look, though, there should be a bar line at the beginning of the system. Normally, in most music, we don't put bar lines at the beginning of the system if there's only one staff. But what I can do is go to Format, Style, and I think it's on System, actually. No, maybe it's under Measure. Maybe it's under Bar Lines. Bar Lines. Bar line at start of single staff. Now I have something that is starting to look that much more like the real book. So I mentioned that one reason I don't like making the clef and key signature go away is if they change over the course of the piece and then you have repeats going back, now you're repeating back into a section, and you're like, oh, shoot, what key am I in now? Right? Because I was in B flat, and now I've repeated over here, and I don't remember what key this section is even in. So that if there's going to be key signatures or clef changes, that's a bad idea. Clef changes happen because of this other thing that I want to show you. It's pretty often that maybe the introduction of a piece, you might want to show two staves. You might want to show a bass line. So I'm going to go into the Instruments menu. I pressed I for the Instruments menu, and I'm going to add a staff. And so I now have a bass line staff, and I'll add some notes to it. It's not much of a bass line. It wasn't really worth notating, but just to illustrate the point. And I only show the bass line there in the introduction. And then probably there's a double bar at the introduction. And then Control M for rehearsal mark will let me write head. And then maybe Control M here, intro. There we go. So this is things you might do in a lead sheet. I don't need that second staff anymore. So the way to make that go away is, what am I doing? Style, back to score, hide empty staves within systems. All right. So now I've made the other staff go away, except which staff went away, right? If you're reading this, you see there's a treble and a bass clef staff. You're reading that first system, and you know that this is all treble clef. And now you get to the second system and you see notes with no clef. You don't know for sure if you're looking at the treble clef staff or the bass clef staff. You just have to assume. And I don't like making people assume. So I don't know. That to me is just one of many reasons why I really don't like that convention of skipping the clef in lead sheets. Its really only purpose was to save a little bit of space and to make it that much easier to get equal measure widths. To me, not worth it. But at least you've seen it and seen the idea there. Yeah, I see the comments on my on the on the story there, and yeah, I don't even remember what tune it was, and I remember nothing about my solo, but that's my thing. I'm off in another world when I'm improvising. In fact, it's a little bit of an out of body experience for me, where it's like I'm looking at my hands play in slow motion, and I might be playing really fast, but it's like I'm floating above the keys, watching a movie of myself playing in slow motion. And kind of when I'm really into it, I'm like kind of hanging on every note going, oh, what note is he going to play next? I bet he should play an E next. And then I play the E. It's like, and all of this happening in real time while I'm playing 16th notes and so forth. It's an amazing experience when it happens this way in real time. And despite how absolutely insane that environment is, or maybe in partly because of how insane that environment was, I feel like I can get into that zone because I have to work so hard to tune out the immense crowd noise, because this is not a polite sit still and listen to jazz crowd. This is a party crowd. They just got out of the ball game because the baseball field's across the street. They're already drunk before they even show up in there, and they're just screaming and yelling and having a great time, and we're playing music, and they are standing literally like 3 feet away from us. One time, drunk people might fall over and crash into the bandstand and hit the microphone or hit the cymbal, and all that happens regularly. So anyhow, just a whole world of stories and memories about that whole experience. So let me just take a look at some of the other things that I wrote. I talked about Smokey. Yeah, it was Smokey back there. Talked about marking the chord symbol and roadmap. Oh yeah, as far as the fonts go, like one reason why handwritten fonts are so nice is that these chord symbols can sometimes get pretty verbose, and you want it to be like, this is what that font looks like normally. Then when you do the special jazz formatting to it, this is the jazz lead sheet template. It uses you can apply that same formatting even if you're not using the jazz lead sheet template. You just go to Format, Style, Chord Symbols, and select the jazz chord symbol appearance. And then there's also these settings here for controlling the scaling of extensions, like D7. You can make that D7 be smaller by changing this value. You can offset it so that it gets superscripted, but the jazz style does that stuff automatically, so you don't actually have to do additional scaling. There's also these two settings, by the way, maximum shift above and below. I've showed those before. They're relatively new, but they allow you to do things like, if this note were up an octave, notice as it gets higher, it pushes that chord symbol higher, and the other chord symbols all align with it, but only up to a point. If I keep going, at some point, once because it was set to 3 spaces, if I get so high with it that it's more than 3 spaces out of alignment, the other chords say, nope, I'm not going to bother. I'm not going to follow you there. You've gone too far for me. And then it's okay to have one chord be out of alignment. So that's something that's set by default, again, in the jazz lead sheet template. So anyhow, the width of this is nice and compressed by getting these things superscripted, and everything about this font is designed to be fairly compressed while still being bold and tall, so that you can have a tall font, because a lot of people, again, you're reading this chart in a dark, smoky bar, and you're not necessarily reading the notes. You want to focus on the chord symbols. So you want the chord symbols big enough and bold enough that you can see them, and yet you want them to not be so verbose that they're long and start colliding with each other and preventing you from fitting as many chords as in the measure as you might want to fit. So that's one of the reasons why fonts like this exist. Plus, just historically, we're used to seeing handwritten lead sheets. In the published lead sheet world, no, they'll well, in the jazz world, there's all sorts of fake books that are published by real. This is published by Hal Leonard here, biggest publisher in the world, probably, or one of them. But other fake books that aren't specifically for a jazz audience will not use the handwritten fonts, and they often don't use big chord symbols, and as a result, they're much, much harder to read. So I would suggest, even if you're not going with the handwritten font, that you make your chord symbols bigger and maybe bold, or find a font that works for you, or just use the jazz font just for your chord symbols. So that's all things that you might want to know about. And as I was talking about that, I thought about something else that I wanted to say about that. Let me think about the font. Oh, yeah. Because the chord symbols are so important to be following, especially for the rhythm section who's not paying as much attention to the notes, there's another customization that the jazz lead sheet template does that, if you're using it, great. If you're not using it, you might want to make this own customization. If I hit Control-T for staff text, it's going to enter it below the staff. Why? Because, well, if it's below the staff, it's in the way of the chord symbols. I mean, it's not physically in the way. MuseScore makes sure they don't collide. It didn't used to, but it now, 5 years ago it didn't, or 3 years ago it didn't, but for the last several years, MuseScore 3 will avoid outright collisions. But it clutters this space where you're really trying to focus on the chord symbols. So it's traditional to put all the rest of the text below the staff. It's exactly the opposite of what happens with vocal music. In choral music, because lyrics are below the staff, all the rest of the text, including dynamics, we typically put above the staff. So in any case, the lead sheet template does that for you. Now, if it's a lead sheet that also has lyrics, now you're going to have a choice. Lyrics. I guess I entered staff text there. Let me try again with lyrics. Control-L. Lyrics. So now we've got our staff text below the lyrics, and maybe that's where you want it, or maybe you want it above. But in any case, lead sheets are going to be that much more full of text than other charts are, because there's so many things to explain in the lead sheet, right? I mean, I'm solo fill. I'm telling people what to do in this bar. I'll show you about that slash notation in a second. Bass pedal, telling the bass player to stay on the E flat there. To solos, text that says, go to the solo section from here. So, and that's there. And then here that says play interlude after each solo, break for next solo. There's all sorts of additional text that you expect in a lead sheet, because the lead sheet is just this sort of basic skeleton. So you're going to have probably more little texts like that in a lead sheet than in other scores. And so a lot of it you're going to want to maybe put below the staff. Now, some of it really needs to go above to make sure, just like the voltas, that you actually see them, because they're part of the roadmap. So some of the text here does go above, and traditionally things like these lines saying solo fill, that's above. But I could have put it below, just hit X, and now it's flipped below. So generally you want to get a lot of things out of the way of the chord symbols, though, and so that's kind of the point of what I'm talking about here. So Oh, one of the other things Jazz Template does is sets wings on your repeat. That's another thing that makes the form easier to see. That setting, again, the Jazz Template does that for you, but you can also just go to Format, Style, I think it's back under bar lines, Winged Repeats right there. So if you watch me uncheck it, then the wings go away. Check it, wings come back. So that's another thing that's typical in handwritten lead sheets, because you're trying to make these things prominent. This slash notation is just a notation that says improvise. And this is like a little improvisation that happens within the melody. Then there's the whole solo section. And if the solos use exactly the same chord progression as the melody, you don't bother writing it out again. You just assume people are going to just keep using the same chord progression that was in the melody. But there's enough complications going on here with the solo fills and these little stop figures that I'm going to talk about in a second, that I thought it was going to be easier to write out the whole solo section. And not just me, this is how it's done. So the way you get this slash notation here is you go and you select the measures you want to fill with slashes, and say Tools, Fill with Slashes. And boom, there you go. They're all filled with slashes. The other thing that I have happen here, though, in my in this tune pinwheel here, is this figure here. Bump, bump, bump. This, the whole rhythm section plays together. Yeah, so it's playing this piece, and then we all together as a rhythm section play that quarter note and then rest here while the soloist is kind of filling. You see that solo fill, dotted line continues, dashed line continues for several measures. So this person is improvising over these 5 measures here, starting there, going to here. But the rhythm section just goes bump, 2, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, bump, 2, 3, 4, bump. So the way you do that is you enter the rhythm, bump, 2, 3, and it doesn't matter what the notes are. So I'll just enter it with a C. Bump, and then a couple of rests, another rest, and then bump. You select, you enter the rhythm, and then you can come in here and say Tools, Toggle Rhythmic Slash Notation. Boom. And now it's turned into that notation. Here's another little trick for you. What if I enter a chord symbol here. C, and then F, C. So I've got chord symbols over the notes. Now, what I can do is select those chord symbols. I clicked one, shift click another, and then say Tools, Realize Chord Symbols. Okay, let me undo that. I actually need to do something else because it's making that chord symbol last longer. I want it to only last as long as the note. So I'm going to say realize. I right click it now and say Realize Chord Symbols, and now it gives me a dialog to let me override that. And I want to say, instead of until the next chord symbol, just the duration of the chord it's attached to. And now it gives me just that. So now when I hit playback, and you're still hearing these playbacks, so let me turn off the actual playback of these chord symbols. So I'm coming over to the inspector and hitting play in case my face is covering that up. So now the chord symbols won't play back, only the notes that Realize Chord Symbols put onto the staff playback. Right, so there I've got that. Now I can go here and say Tools, Toggle Rhythmic Slash Notation. And now when I do this, it's not actually going to play that, because normally these slash chords don't, we usually turn off the playback because people don't go to that much trouble, right? So it's going to play back silence, but all I have to do is select that range again, go to Notes, and turn the play back on. And now, there you go. So that is a way of getting that playback to work a little better than it otherwise would. So, so that sax player, you know, I am now friends with him on Facebook, but I don't know that I've ever actually saw him again after that. Um, he might have come into the club once years later, but yeah, not so much. So tangent, I'm always good with tangent. At what point does it become so multi atonal that you'd rather not put in a key signature at all? That is an excellent question, not beside the point at all. I go there really often. To me, unless it is totally, totally, totally clearly in a key, I don't use key signatures. Like this piece here is in a key. It's absolutely, let's see. So that piece is totally in the key of E flat. I can explain every single chord there just talking about standard harmonic devices in the key of E flat. It's a very typical bluesy, funky kind of chord progression, nothing at all unusual about it. It's E flat. But I have tons and tons of pieces that are just not that clearly in a key. And Giant Steps is a great example. Giant Steps just moves between the key of B, G, and E flat. It's following the circle of major thirds, if such a term exists. It does now, if it didn't before. And it doesn't stay in any key for more than two measures at a time. And there's any number of other pieces where, yes, there's chord symbols, so you don't want to call it atonal because that implies something else to most people. It's non-tonal or modal or whatever. It doesn't really have a clear sense of a key in a traditional sense. So there's no sense wasting people's times with key signatures. So I'm very eager is maybe not the right word, but not at all reluctant to omit key signatures. And if you're going to do that, by the way, don't use C major. If you want the thing to have no key signature, don't enter C major as your key, because if you do that, when you produce a transpose chart, like for trumpet or saxophone, it's going to transpose that key signature. Instead, use the atonal key signature. Now it won't transpose. So that even if I go to, let me go to staff properties, change the instrument to say alto saxophone, and it's transposing the notes, but not the key signature. And that's what you generally want if you're creating that kind of music. So there you go. Yes, and it makes the key signatures at the beginning go away also, of course. So which fonts work well with the chord extensions? Oh, yeah. So and that is definitely true. If there are different places where flats and sharps can exist within a font. There's the old style Unicode place, and then there's the new style, what's called Smoofle, the standard music font layout, I think is what it is called. That's a newer standard, and they each have different places where the flats go. And then most software programs use their own system before Smoofle came out, and so there's usually a third place where a font might have a flat sign. So depending on which font has which flat signs in which places, you very likely are going to find that some fonts, like when you try to have a chord symbol that says B flat 7, free serif works great, but if I start changing that, Garamond, it's okay. Georgia, well, that's interesting. The 7 is offset. I didn't know that happened. This font, some of the fonts anyhow, don't have their own flat signs. And so they're like this one, I think, isn't having its own flat sign. It's substituting one from another font. And I'm just going through these different fonts. And when it's substituting these fonts, they're mismatched, and the spacing is often not correct because the font that it's substituting from, we don't have real great control over what font it's substituting. So if you try to use a font that doesn't have its own flat sign in the proper place, it's just going to, the operating system is going to substitute some other font's flat sign, and it's probably not going to be spaced well. So for 3.6, we've tried to improve this by improving how that font system works, but we've also introduced a new font so that if you don't like free serif, which is the default font if you're not using Jazz, if you don't like free serif, there's a new font called Edwin that is a new serif-based font, and it's also going to work. But basically, you're just going to have to figure out for yourself which fonts work. Some of them have nicely positioned, like this flat sign seems decent. This one, it's clearly just substituting some fallback one. All these ones, basically, you can see how identical they look. They're thin and they have too much space after them. So this one, oh, that's mine. Campagna, that's the font that I designed for Roman numeral analysis. So yeah, you're just going to have to figure that out for yourself, basically, which fonts on your system happen to work well. Now, if you are handy designing fonts, then you can just go in and copy the font character from somewhere else, or just go in and edit the font. Make sure there is a font sign at the proper SMUFL location, but you have to know about font editing to do that. So, so where's the, yeah, I go fast. So, there's, the keep chord symbols at the same height is in format, and all chord symbol related symbols will be format. So let me slow down again. Format, style. This is where most of the style settings are, and then chord symbols down here. So here are these settings: maximum shift above and maximum shift below. They default to 0 only because we added that thing later and we didn't want to affect existing scores. You know, if they were designed not to do that, then we didn't want to mess them up. But the Jazz template, when you create new scores, it sets it to 3, and I think that's a good value. So I set both above and below to 3 because the below is useful for Roman numeral analysis. This is also where you can set the spacing between chord symbols, so that if there's one chord symbol and another one right next to it, it controls the minimum amount of space between them. This one about the bar line distance doesn't do what it's actually designed to do originally, because we re-implemented things, so I wouldn't pay much attention. But it has to do with chord symbols at the end of a measure overlapping the bar line. So just know that that's a setting that can be played with if you have issues with that. These settings here, so like here, that extension scaling, if I make that a little smaller, like 0.8, you can see that 7 got smaller, and now I can raise it by, I'm hitting the down arrow because that makes a negative offset here, and that makes things go up. That's something to know in MuseScore, right? So I'm making that extension go up and be superscripted a bit. So that setting now, that's not a font that's a particularly good match for, but let's go back to free serif. It matches pretty well there. So that's how you can do that. So free serif works pretty well for these things. Edwin works pretty well for these things when 3.6 comes out. Anything else, it's you know, yeah, we have no control over anyone else's fonts. So yeah, so many different things to talk about with lead sheets, but I'm talking about things. So all the songs in C. So I guess if you see a book with all songs in C, first of all, yes, it's probably for beginners, unless it's this other thing that we were just talking about, where it's not really in C, it's just there was no meaningful chord symbol. So let me show you a lead sheet for another one of my pieces here. So this is a lead sheet where there's no key signature, not because it's in C, and not because there's anything simple about this piece. Oh, I need to turn chord symbols on for this because I've never loaded this one into 3.5 before. So I'm going oh, that's the thing. When by default chord symbols play, right, in 3.5 or later. But if you load an older score, they won't play because they didn't used to play and people were getting put off by that. So that's fine. It's turned off by default for old scores. If you decide, no, I want all my old scores to play, you can go to Edit, Preferences, Advanced, and Score, Harmony, Play, Disable Compatibility. That option is checked by default. That means it's disabling harmony, which is chord symbols. It's disabling chord symbol playback for compatibility's sake for older scores. And it's not disabling it for new scores. But if you want all your new scores to not play them back, then check that, and then new scores won't play them back either. Or if you want your older scores to play back, uncheck this, and then Now your old scores won't disable the chord symbols. That setting is applied when you open the score, though. So this isn't going to suddenly start playing back. So those just control what happens when you first open or first create the score. After that, though, you go to the inspector here. So I can go to that chord symbol, turn on playback, and then set as style. And now all my chord symbols play back. So yeah, there's nothing simplistic about this piece. It just has no key signature. But yeah, I have seen some really simplified fake books that just put everything in C for really simple children's songs, or I could totally imagine that being a thing. Yeah, so that's. Oh, that's the other thing. Yes, maybe that's what you mean. So like. So yeah, it could be that the songs are literally in C, but this fake book here, everything is in what's called concert pitch, right? So this song here, "In the Mood," if you're familiar with that, classic Glenn Miller piece, boobity bum 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 bum. Is that an A flat? Let me find myself an A flat. Bum. Nope, not even close. Bum boobadoo bum 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 bum. Okay, so I know it says G sharp, but I know it sounds like A flat. So this is the actual key that the song sounds like in B flat, but that's called concert pitch. Sometimes it says C instruments because a trumpet in C plays in concert pitch, or a flute in C. So sometimes fake books will say C or concert version to make it clear that this is the version that's not transposed. But then there'll usually be a B flat version. That doesn't mean the songs are in B flat. It means they're transposed for B flat instruments, so that a trumpet will have everything transposed up a step. So when the trumpet plays, they're in the same key that I am in as a pianist. So yeah, you will see fake books that say C version, or they'll say C version or something like that. It doesn't mean the songs are in C. But if you're actually flipping through it and the songs are in C, then it's because they're just trying to make it simple for beginners. So the Omni book has no key signatures at all, and that's actually kind of crazy because all those songs have a clear key. I mean, they're all blues rhythm changes. They're all really clear tonal pieces. And yet, the guy who transcribed them, Jamie Aebersold, I think, just elected to use no key signatures. I think it's because the Omni book is a book of transcribed improvised solos by Charlie Parker, and Charlie Parker's language is complex enough, harmonically complex enough. There's so many accidentals that that's the other thing, is even if there's a clear sense of key, if your melody is highly chromatic, a lot of accidentals, then it can also be not worth the trouble of a key signature because it's just too much to keep track of. So that's something else. So, all right. So see you later, Mark, and thanks for being with us. Okay. Just a couple other things that I want to talk about here. So I'm going to look through this chart to see if there's anything else interesting in here. Oh yeah. So here's one where I'm showing that rhythmic slash notation along with the melody. So I showed you here how to create that rhythmic slash notation. But what if you want that along with melody? So here's what you do. You enter your melody. Okay, I do that an octave higher. Okay, I think it chose that octave because the chord symbol playback included a bass note, and it was looking at that to decide what octave it thought I wanted. So anyhow, there's my melody, and now say I want this rhythm on top of it. So I'm going to enter that rhythm into voice 3, and I'll just enter it. It doesn't even matter, again, what pitch you pick, but I can go C, and then in the next measure, C, rest, rest, C. So I have that rhythm entered into voice 3. Now I select this. I use the selection filter under the view menu, selection filter, to exclude voice 1. So now only voice 3 is selected. And now I'm going to run that same toggle rhythmic slash notation command, and boom, it knows voice 3. Well, that's just the rule we follow. Voice 3, it'll place above the staff. Voice 4 will place below the staff. And so now you can have that slash notation while also having your melody. Now, when you do that, it thinks, oh, you've got multiple voices. I should probably offset these rests. And so that's a little bit of a drag. You'll have to fix the rest. That's something that we actually tried to fix. But yeah, I was hoping that would work. Yeah, so really this rest here should be back on the staff so that you can see it. And then so should that half rest. It should be, so you can see the rest that goes with the melody as well as the rests that go with the slash notation. So, and actually these rests aren't high enough. I think that's because of this automatic thing that we added recently that tries to offset the rests. It's actually interfering because the slash notation should have placed those rests up a notch too. So I'm doing that manually by just hitting the up arrow. So that's something else that happens. The other thing that happens is if you're going to have a coda, the coda is usually offset some. So I'll select this measure. Oh, I have to enable voice 1 again. Anytime you use the selection filter to disable voice 1, remember to enable it again or you can't select anything. So I select measure 1. I select this measure, and I'll go ahead and put the coda sign on it under the... Actually, it's also in my handy-dandy... Oh, it's not in my handy-dandy layout palette. Oh, well. It's in my repeats palette, which I think... Yeah, I moved up to the top. So I put my coda sign there to say, here's the coda. And then we probably want to indent this system. So I have a shortcut, Control-Alt-H. That'll add a horizontal frame there. And that's always a nice thing that you can do. But if you don't want to, remember, if you don't want to define and remember a shortcut, just add a horizontal frame from the palette. The frames and spacers palette. And then also you probably do want a spacer. You probably want this coda system to be further away than the other system. So I'm going to add a spacer up. And I'm going to size that thing to just sort of push itself away so that the coda is physically separated. I think I do that in Pinwheel. Maybe I don't. But I do indent something here. I also use a horizontal frame at the end of a system to prevent that last measure before, because I had a situation where I have a second ending here or a last ending here, and I wanted it to be on a system by itself, and so I put a frame before it to indent it and a frame after it to prevent it from going all the way to the end. So let's take a look at that. Let's come back to my little sample thing here. Let's get rid of that line break. And I'm going to insert another horizontal frame, put my line break on that frame. And now I can just, I'm using Control arrow to increase this thing a staff space at a time. And now I can have that system not go all the way to the end if I want, which is pretty common, if you've only got, say, one measure. Say that I only was going to have 2 measures on that last system, and then this was going to be presumably a DS, right? So probably there's a DS alcoda here. And then you don't necessarily want that to stretch all the way to the end of the system. So this kind of stuff, of this formatting, of having these incomplete systems that start not at the left or end not at the right, and maybe have this extra space to keep the coda separated. So again, when we're sight reading on bandstands, we can process this nicely. So these are the kinds of things you do creating lead sheets. So there's lots other things that come up. You can do almost anything you would ever want to do. And I can tell you this because I worked on this. This is volume 1 of The Real Book, which is probably the most popular fake book in the world. And I worked not on volume 1, but on volume 2, volume 3, volume 4, and then a rock fake book and a pop real book and all these other books in the Real Book series that I worked on, editing charts and doing exactly this kind of layout, making these same decisions. I know the rules that publishers use, and we would discuss them. Well, when is worth breaking these rules, and what is the best way to represent a thing? And I've used a ton of other fake books, so I know, kind of how other people do things in their fake books that may be different from how this one does. And I'm telling you this not to brag, I know all these things, but to say, if there was something that I thought was important to do and MuseScore couldn't do it, I generally worked to make sure MuseScore could do it in the next release or so. So this whole business about not being able to have an easy way to make force measures the same width, still my bad. I haven't managed to get that happening yet, but it's kind of on the list of things we really want to deal with for MuseScore 4. But again, it's a little bit overrated to get them completely even, and I've already showed you how to get them mostly even. So, but yeah, pretty much anything else that lead sheets might want to do, I have managed to make sure. Like I implemented the slash notation command. I implemented a lot of the stuff that has to do with how chord symbols work, so that you can type either C7 flat 9 flat 5, or you can type C7 flat 5 flat 9, and it understands it either way. That didn't used to be the case. It used to be you had to type it exactly the way it said. And I can type C. I guess I accidentally put on caps lock. C M for minor, or MI, or MIN, doesn't matter. It's going to understand it as minor. I didn't implement the chord symbol playback, but I mentored the person who did. So anyhow, a lot of the lead sheet specific stuff I implemented based on my experience as a professional editor for lead sheets. So pretty well, if it's something that lead sheets do in real life, I've managed to make sure it's possible to do and as painless to do as possible. So hopefully I've covered a bunch of the things that maybe you all might encounter. I can see that I've done just about everything that's mentioned in here. One of the other things that's in the Jazz lead sheet template is like, where is those voltas here? If I type a chord symbol here now, notice that chord symbol kind of collided with that volta a little bit. And that's what pushed the volta up. So MuseScore doesn't actually create a collision, but it pushed the volta up out of its normal position. The Jazz lead sheet template, and by the way, you can also load style. You can save, like you can set up one score the way you want and then say save style. So I've created a Jazz style that is basically the lead sheet template plus some of my own customizations. And when I open that now, it okay, well, I did that when I was in 3.6. But one of the things that it did was it changed some of the settings for the size of the chord symbols. It changed basically everything to look as if it was with the lead sheet template. And one of the things it did is it offsets the offsets that volta a little bit. So you can see this line here isn't exactly vertical. It's pushed the volta a little bit to the left so that the number avoids that chord symbol. I also customized where that number is. It's a little closer to the edge there. And I'm doing all that so that chord symbols and voltas can coexist more peacefully. So the template does a lot of that kind of stuff for you. So so hopefully these things help. I'm gonna probably sign off in a minute, but there's a great question from, I believe, Michael Gold. I believe that's what I remember the MGing, and then I've seen you in one of my other classes. So when you're writing a lead sheet and then you have transposing instruments, I personally don't do anything really special for that. I set up my score the way I want, and then I do exactly what you saw me do here. Is I go and say, staff properties. I guess I have to right-click the staff. Sorry. I go to staff properties, change instrument, pick my instrument, and then come up here into that title frame, and I add part name and call it E flat version, except I guess part name in this template is not set up to be at the top of the frame, and I want it to be. So let me come over here and change that alignment to top of frame. There we go, E flat version. And by the way, to type that flat sign, I typed Control Shift B. That enters a flat sign. Control Shift sharp number sign enters a sharp sign. Not that you need that here. So I do that, and then I export to PDF and call it good. Now, realistically, some of these chords might want to be respelled. Like this was a B7 chord, I think, originally, or an E7, I forget. but when it's transposed, it's G sharp 7. But no, I want to call it A flat 7. Yeah, I'd much rather call it A flat 7. It was a B7. So I'd rather call it A flat 7. So I'm going to have to change the spelling of this chord. And realistically, I will, maybe go through and find if there's a few other little places where maybe the melody got too high when it transposed for alto sax, and I have to drop one little passage down an octave. So I'll do little edits like that. And if it takes me more than 30 seconds to do those edits, I'm like, oh, I never want to have to do this again. And I'll just save as and create another copy of that thing, E flat version. But normally I just do the one lead sheet, make the change that I want, export to PDF, and call it good. And then I do another version for B flat. But I have seen people do what you're talking about. And so what you can totally do is now add another version, say for tenor saxophone, add another staff. Oh, and I think I turned on hide empty staves. Oh, so that's the other thing, is now that staff is I added a staff, but hide empty staves is turned on, so you can't even see that staff until I enter notes into it. So I'm going to have to turn off hide empty staves. Yeah, it's possible to do all the things that I'm talking about here. Turn off hide empty staves so I can see my tenor staff. Did I not enter? I guess I didn't enter the tenor staff. That's also a part of the problem. Tenor staff. There we go. So I could have actually gone back and turned hide empty staves back on, because it would have not hit them in the first system. So whatever. I can select everything on that staff and then paste it in here and definitely drop it down an octave. Then what I can do, so now I'll have a score for each instrument. And then what you can do is generate parts. Right? You can go to File, Parts, and say I want to generate all parts. But the thing is, when you do that, the alto, well, now all those nice line breaks and things that I added are gone when I do that. So maybe you don't do that. Maybe instead you just hide the other one. Like if I want to keep the tenor, I might just hide the alto. And now I've got a tenor version of this. Oh, I better delete those staff names, right? There we go. So now I have a tenor version. I probably should be in the habit of doing that, because it's not a bad habit to be in. I just am not. But it's a pretty good idea. It does work well. So, yeah. What? Hiding of staff. Oh, hiding of staff lines mid-system, so you can have chords only and no lines. So, oh, that's great to know. So it's talking about like if you want to have chords on the staff. So I know I'm going on a long time here, but whatever. You can, if you want to move this chord symbol onto the staff, you can certainly move it onto the staff and then set that as the default offset. And you'll also need to set the minimum distance there as the default. So because otherwise it's trying to avoid a collision with the staff. So this minimum distance, -999, it automatically did that when I moved that on the staff. So now my staves my chord symbols are on the staff, and you can go to staff properties and make the staff lines invisible. And so now that's kind of nice. And then you can also make all those rests invisible and so forth. So what Adam is saying is you can also like change from invisible staff lines to visible staff lines, or at least you can apparently as of a change that was merged a few weeks ago. I haven't tried it yet. But if I go to 3.6, and maybe next week we'll take a look at that, I'll show you how some of the new features that are coming in 3.6. And there's already the feature that allows you to change some staff properties like mid-score. Like if you want to change to only, like here, we'll talk about it next week. But there is a feature that lets you change some staff properties mid-score, but it only supported a few properties, and some of them didn't work right. And so for 3.6, we've expanded on that some. So yeah, that's great. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to checking that out. So we are within days, hopefully. I mean, I thought that last week, but I think it more this week, that very, very, very soon we're going to have this MuseScore 3.6 beta. It's looking really good. There's just a few bugs we want to fix before we put it out as a beta. Otherwise, everyone's going to report the same 2 bugs. So next week's Café will almost certainly consist of me showing off MuseScore 3.6 beta. And then I'd love to get you guys to test it and give your comments on it so we can fix any bugs that get found, make any final improvements that need to be made, and release the real 3.6 perhaps by the end of the year. So I've showed you a whole bunch of stuff. And these are, creating lead sheets is something I do a lot of. And so I've made sure that as many of the things that need to happen in lead sheets are as convenient to do as possible. So hopefully you found this useful and maybe learned a thing or two if you didn't already know how to do it, or learned a thing or two about lead sheets in general if that's sort of a new world to you. So I'm going to sign off here, and I want to thank everyone so much for being here and engaging and all for the comments and everything. And tomorrow, again, my music master class. So I actually messed up. When I started the Café, I accidentally broadcast on the Masterclass channel. So the link, if you're on my mailing list, the link I sent out yesterday is no longer going to be good. And I apologize for that. I'll have to send out a new link. But the Music Masterclass will be here. All you have to do is come to my YouTube channel. So if you haven't already, subscribe. So I got to do all the whole commercial business right before I sign off. Just if you haven't already subscribed on YouTube, do it. And then also, here's my school. I've got my MuseScore course. I've got the Music Masterclass here. So by all means, there's the Music Masterclass. Sign up. You'll get notifications about stuff. So I will now sign off and see you all either tomorrow for the Masterclass or next week for the Café, I hope. And have a great day